back to the channel. Today we're going to unravel some incredibly complex events in Genoa. Rumors are swirling around the Newman family, but what's the truth? In this video, I'll summarize the plot points revealed in episode 6 and offer some personal theories about Kane's next move to expose Victor's sinister schemes. Is he protecting his family or executing a new takeover plan? Let's analyze it together. Victor's belated regret. Genoa City is never truly quiet, but on these summer mornings, the city wears a mask of false serenity. Sunlight streams through the glass windows of Newman Enterprises, traffic glides smoothly along the boulevards, and inside a luxurious suite at the Grand Chancellor Hotel. Nikki Newman sits before her vanity mirror with both hands gripping the tabletop as though she is trying to keep not only her body, but also her spirit from collapsing. This is not the first time the pain has come. The headaches had begun creeping into her life weeks earlier. At first, they were only vague, stabbing sensations in the late afternoons enough to notice, but not enough to worry about. Nikki had endured too much in her life: abuse, alcoholism, loss, betrayal to learn how to categorize pain. These headaches, she convinced herself, were nothing more than stress. And stress was something she had in abundance. Nick was struggling with addiction. She and Victor were living apart after one of the longest and stormiest marriages in Genoa City history. Matt Clark, a name she thought had been buried forever in the past, had suddenly resurfaced with fragmented memories and a remorse she wasn't sure she could trust. And here was Nikki Newman, the woman who once danced on stage before rising to become the matriarch of an empire, sitting alone in a hotel suite pretending that a headache was no big deal. But this morning felt different. As Nikki stared into the mirror, her vision blurred for a split second as if someone had held a foggy sheet of glass in front of her eyes and then quickly pulled it away. Just 1 second. But it was enough to make her heart tighten. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and opened them again. Everything was clear. She looked back at her reflection, and the woman staring back had the eyes of someone who had just realized she was standing at the edge of a cliff. Victoria knocked on the door at the very moment Nikki was trying to regain her composure. Her daughter entered carrying the expression of someone who had been worried for weeks, but was still trying to appear calm. Nikki immediately recognized that look. It was the same look she had once seen in her own reflection years ago, before everything in her life began to fall apart. Victoria didn't say much. She simply stood there and looked at her mother, and in her eyes was everything left unspoken, that she had noticed, that she was worried, that she could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. Nikki wanted to protest. She wanted to say she was fine, that these were merely symptoms of her recurring multiple sclerosis, that her neurologist would confirm it and everything would be okay. But she remembered the moment her vision had blurred in the mirror, and this time she couldn't bring herself to say the words. That was why Nikki Newman, the woman who had resisted everyone's concern for weeks, finally nodded and agreed to see a doctor. The doctor's office was nothing remarkable. It was a bright room with cream-colored walls, a dark wooden desk, neatly arranged medical textbooks on shelves, and fluorescent lights reflecting off polished tile floors. Victoria sat upright in a chair in the corner, maintaining the posture her mother had always taught her, even though her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Nikki sat on the examination table, doing her best to remain composed. She had been in rooms like this many times before after accidents, relapses, and the countless ways her body had betrayed her over the years. She knew how to sit still and listen. She knew how to keep her face calm even when everything inside her was anything but. The doctor spoke for about 15 minutes. Medical terms fell like Stone's test results, MRI scans, numbers and percentages that Nikki understood in theory, but could not yet fully process or accept as being about her. Time was limited. Treatment needed to begin immediately. Her chances of survival depended on how quickly they acted. When the doctor stepped out to give them a moment alone, Victoria rose and walked to her mother. She said nothing. She simply placed a hand on Nikki's shoulder, and Nikki, the woman who had learned long ago never to cry in front of others, felt every ounce of borrowed strength within her begin to dissolve. Just one moment of weakness. Then she straightened herself again. She thought of Victor. The thought came naturally, almost instinctively. In every crisis of her life, Victor Newman had always been the first person she thought of. No matter how fiercely they had fought, no matter how deeply they had hurt each other in ways no one else could fully understand, no matter that they were currently separated and their wounds were still fresh, Victor was still Victor. He was still the man she had loved, hated, forgiven, and begun again with more times than anything else in her life. But immediately after that thought came fear, sharp and unmistakable. She didn't want Victor to know because of pity. She didn't want him returning to her side out of duty or guilt. For decades, Nikki Newman had struggled to define the line between genuine love and dependency, between strength and the need to be rescued. And now, faced with a life-threatening diagnosis, the last thing she wanted was to see sympathy in Victor's eyes instead of love. She shook her head before Victoria could even suggest it. "Don't tell your father," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Not yet. Not now." Victoria looked at her mother with the expression of someone battling herself. The silence that followed lasted longer than usual. It was the kind of silence Nikki had learned to read through years of motherhood, not agreement, but restraint. Victoria was holding something back, weighing her love for her mother against the practical judgment of a realistic woman, searching desperately for balance. Nikki knew her daughter. She knew Victoria would not stay silent forever. In the days that followed, Nikki's life settled into a new rhythm: appointments with specialists, prescription forms, and private conversations with Victoria that she tried to keep from spreading beyond the family. She attended AA meetings with Nick, standing beside her son and trying to be his anchor while internally feeling completely lost herself. She smiled at acquaintances in the halls of the Grand Chancellor, nodded politely, kept her back straight and her chin high because Nikki Newman knew how to perform, even when there was no stage left. Victor saw her several times that week. He was occupied with many things: his plans involving Matt Clark, the restructuring of Chancellor, and the endless business manipulations that had become second nature to him over the decades. But he looked at her in a way that told her he sensed something was wrong. Victor Newman, despite all his enormous blind spots, had always possessed the uncanny ability to see through Nikki in a way no one else could. He asked her about it, more gently than she expected, but he still asked. She told him she was fine, that these were familiar symptoms, that he didn't need to worry. And for a brief moment before he masked his emotions, he saw genuine concern in his eyes, a concern she didn't know how to handle. That was the most complicated thing about Victor Newman. He could be extraordinarily ruthless, selfish, and blind to the people around him whenever he was pursuing his goals. Yet at the same time, his love for Nikki, however distorted, however poorly expressed, was the truest thing within him. And that was exactly why Nikki didn't want him to know the truth. Not because she doubted his love, but because she doubted whether she would be strong enough to tell the difference between love and pity while she herself was so vulnerable. Victoria watched all of this unfold and felt herself being torn in two. On one hand, she understood her mother's hesitation. She had witnessed too many occasions when Nikki accepted Victor's tenderness during a crisis, only to wonder later whether he stayed because he truly wanted to or because he simply couldn't walk away. On the other hand, Victoria knew her father. For all his flaws, Victor Newman would never forgive himself if he discovered that the truth had been hidden from him while Nikki fought this battle alone. And beneath all those calculations was a simpler, raw fear, one she could not disguise: that she might lose her mother. That the mornings spent watching Nikki sit before a mirror, the afternoons spent together in comfortable silence, all those seemingly ordinary moments were quietly counting down toward an ending. Victoria Newman, a woman who had learned to control her emotions better than almost anyone in her family, perhaps even better than Victor himself, felt completely helpless for the first time in years. Victoria confronts Victor. Victor's office at Newman Tower that afternoon carried the atmosphere of an approaching storm. Victoria walked in with the posture of someone who had no intention of sitting down. He looked up and immediately recognized that expression, the one Nikki sometimes wore, the look of someone who had endured enough and had finally decided to stop pretending. Victor set down his pen. The conversation was not easy to hear. Victoria did not yell. She was not the type to yell. She had never learned that from her mother. Instead, she spoke calmly and precisely, with the emotional control she had inherited from her father himself. Because of that, every word carried even more weight. She told him about the past several weeks, about how her mother had faced increasingly worsening symptoms alone while Victor remained occupied with his own plans, about how Nikki had tried to explain everything away as stress from Nick's struggles, from their separation, from Nat Clark's return, all those storms piling up until Nikki was carrying them by herself. She told him about the afternoon in the doctor's office, about watching her mother hear the diagnosis and struggle not to fall apart, about the nights she sat beside Nikki in silence because neither of them knew what to say. Victor listened. He did not interrupt. That was unusual for a man who was not accustomed to sitting quietly and listening, and Victoria noticed it. But she noticed something else in her father's eyes as well, not defensiveness, not the familiar arrogance that often surfaced when he was criticized, but a quiet kind of pain she rarely saw on Victor Newman's face. It made her soften and grow angrier at the same time, because this was what she had never known how to handle about her father. He could become genuinely vulnerable in moments like these, and that vulnerability always made it difficult for her to stand her ground. Within her anger was love. Within that love was pain. And within that pain was a question she could never bring herself to ask aloud. Why couldn't there be just one time when he was there before the crisis happened instead of only after it had already arrived? Victor finally spoke. He did not make excuses. He did not change the subject. He simply looked at his daughter and admitted in words that did not come naturally to him that he had failed to see it. That he had been here, but not truly present. That he did not even know what to call that failure. Victoria left the office without feeling as though she had won, because no one wins conversations like that. His private medical team immediately contacted 3 research centers conducting the most advanced clinical trials available for treating the disease. Michael Baldwin flew to Geneva to handle the legal complications involved in enrolling an American patient in a European clinical trial. Victor personally called the head of research at a hospital in Japan whose programs he had funded for years. Newman Enterprises, with all its financial power and global influence, was suddenly operating not for profit, not for market strategy, not for any of the usual reasons. The days that followed were colored by uncertainty, not the kind of uncertainty the Newman family usually faced, with business decisions and family power struggles, but the raw, uncontrollable uncertainty of a progressing illness. Nikki began treatment. There were exhausting days, good days and bad days, moments of hope and moments of heaviness. Victoria spent as much time with her as possible, balancing the demands of running Newman Media while trying to remain her mother's anchor. Nick, dealing with his own recovery journey, learned the truth and did his best to be present, though the line between helping and becoming an additional burden often felt painfully thin. Victor carved out a role for himself that had no clear title. He was not officially Nikki's husband at the moment because they were still separated, yet he could not stand on the sidelines either. He existed somewhere in between. And Nikki allowed it, not because she had forgiven everything, but because this was not the time for rigid boundaries. Adam, as always, navigated the situation in his own way. He was less physically present than Victoria or even Nick, but more observant than anyone else. He noticed what others were too occupied to see. Victor was genuinely changing. Perhaps not completely. Perhaps old wounds would not disappear simply because a new crisis had emerged, but he was changing. There were evenings when the entire family gathered together, not because Victor arranged it, not because there was an agenda, but simply because they wanted to be there. Victoria and Adam, who normally sat on opposite sides of arguments about business or about which child Victor favored more, now sat beside one another in silence, without the usual tension. Nick, despite carrying burdens of his own, made an effort to show up. And Victor sat closer to Nikki than before, listening more than speaking, not because anyone asked him to, but because he chose to. Those moments did not heal anything, but they were real. On my channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.